Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
we can start formulating sets of demands.
How a new law could change the dynamic between Chicago Public Schools and the Teachers Union.
Fully vaccinated people can resume travel at low risk to themselves.
The CDC says fully vaccinated people can now travel safely, but what does a new COVID surge mean for the summer vacation season?
Plus, a vaccine passport will be the key for that travel. Will it be key? We weigh the legal and ethical concerns as the country looks to reopen.
Let us not forget that a mother's child is dead.
When will body camera footage be released in the death of a 13-year-old named Adam Toledo, who was fatally shot by police in Little Village?
A state bill on Governor J.B. Pritzker's desk classifies violence as a public health crisis and takes aims at inequities in the healthcare system.
United Airlines lands into the Georgia voting law debate. That and more business headlines from Cranes.
Music for me always is a reflection of a time and a culture.
And we take you back in time with an immersive experience set in the 1920s. But first, some of today's top stories. Mayor Lori Lightfoot and Police Superintendent David Brown say the Chicago Police Department should be rewriting its rules around foot pursuits. This after last week's death of 13-year-old Adam Toledo, shot by a police officer in Little Village during a foot pursuit.
Unfortunately, the final version of the consent decree put this issue off for several years, but it is now past time to act. Tragedies like these also underscore the urgency of reforming CPD's foot pursuit policy, not tomorrow, but now.
The mayor says that while officers engage in hundreds of foot pursuits each year, they're dangerous for the officers and members of the public. But she offered no specifics about what policy changes are needed. Superintendent Brown did share more with reporters on the events of the shooting, which you can read about on our website. And the city's Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, is expected to release the body camera video of that shooting sometime soon. We'll have more on that later in the program. Meanwhile, in the sixth day of trial, Minneapolis's police chief has testified that former cop Derek Chauvin's actions did violate departmental policy in pressing his knee into George Floyd's neck once he was handcuffed behind his back and lying on his stomach.
The conscious neck restraint by policy mentions light to moderate pressure. When I look at Exhibit 17, and when I look at the facial expression of Mr. Floyd, that does not appear in any way, shape, or form that is light to moderate pressure.
Chief Madaria Arredondo told jurors that Chauvin should have allowed Floyd to get up sooner, that the 19-year police veteran failed in his duty to render first aid, and that he violated policy requiring officers to de-escalate tense situations with no or minimal force. Chauvin's attorneys countered that Chauvin did what he was trained to do and that Floyd's use of illegal drugs and underlying health conditions caused his death. The Illinois Department of Public Health says more than 2,100 more people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus and 11 have died since yesterday. The state's total case count is over 1,258,000 and 21,384 people have died since the pandemic began. Nearly 19% of Illinois residents have been vaccinated. And now to Paris for what a vaccine passport could look like and potential legal concerns surrounding the concept. Paris.
Brandis, a growing number of companies say they will require proof of vaccination before opening their doors. The Biden administration is working with private companies to develop standards to prove vaccination status, though it doesn't have plans to implement any kind of federal program yet. This comes as the United Kingdom plans to test the so-called vaccine passport concept and as Israel's Green Pass system has been in place since February. And joining us to discuss legal and ethical considerations are Craig Klugman, a bioethicist and professor at DePaul University, Colleen Connell, executive director of the ACLU of Illinois, and Daniel Rodriguez, Harold Washington professor of law at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law. Welcome, all of you. Craig, briefly describe for us what a vaccine passport would look like in the context of COVID-19.
So a vaccine passport is simply a government-issued piece of paper or app that notes that you have been vaccinated for COVID-19. And we've had these since 1969. This is one that was created by the World Health Organization for yellow fever. And so it's not a new concept, but that's what it would look like. And most of the ones we're talking about now are electronic. So it would be an app on your phone.
And Daniel Rodriguez, what kind of legal standing would an organization, say the Chicago Cubs, or a restaurant, or a public sector organization like a library have if they chose to enforce vaccine passport or proof of vaccination?
Well, it depends, first, as your examples note, whether it's a public sector or private sector. The requirements are not identical, and the powers that an entity, an organization would have would in fact depend in no small part about whether it's public or private. So a public organization would have some amount of authority. If it's a state and local government, they would have to find that sourced in a state statute or state regulation. They would certainly be subject to civil liberties issues and potential objections from individuals, and they would have to turn square corners with respect to the requirements they impose, but also that the rights and privacy considerations that they provide. Ditto private organizations, although it's fair to say that private organizations and businesses from the Chicago Cubs to the local restaurant would have a wider latitude to require such restrictions and regulations on their employees and their guests.
Hey, Colleen Connell, what kind of civil liberties issues might crop up if organizations were to go this route, or public entities?
Again, just to echo Daniel, it really depends on whether it's a private or a public entity in large measure. I think it raises serious constitutional but not insurmountable issues for government to mandate vaccines or a vaccine credential or passport. I think that moving from the public sector to the private sector, companies have been allowed broad latitude to determine the conditions under which they will operate their business, so long as they don't use the wrong reasons. So, for example, a healthcare employer might be able to require employees to have a vaccine as a condition of employment, but if that healthcare employer enforced that vaccine requirement in a discriminatory way, say only against women or only against people of color, that would raise legal issues for that private entity.
So a lot of things that organizations will have to keep in mind. Craig Klugman, equity has been a big issue in terms of the rollout of a vaccine. How would equity play into the concept of a vaccine passport?
Well, it will echo what has happened with this disease and with the vaccine rollout, right? So people who have gotten it the most, who have been hospitalized the most and died the most, are people of color and older people. And they are also the same people who are less likely to have the devices. The Biden administration has been looking at 17 apps that are being developed. They're all private companies. They said the federal government won't want one. And you need to have the smartphone in order to have this app appear on it. So that's one issue. Another issue is that if this is used to prevent or to admit access to public events, say a concert or a ball game or to a specific restaurant into more public areas, then people who have been discriminated against in terms of the pandemic are likely to find themselves more discriminated against because they are least likely to have access to this vaccine that is now necessary to have entry into these fields. So you have lack of access to the technology because, again, it's not going to be a piece of paper this time around. And you have lack of access to the vaccine that's necessary to be able to partake in our public life.
And Daniel Rodriguez, as Craig mentioned, you have 17 private companies developing some kind of app. The Biden administration is going to give them guidance. What would you guide the Biden administration to guide these 17 private companies in developing something like this?
Well, without delving too deeply into the technology, which is, shall I say, above my pay grade, let me give maybe a little bit of a positive spin on Craig's description, which I agree with. I think the question of developing an app in order to require individuals to actually present a smartphone and show through the app that they've become vaccinated is problematic for just the reasons he said. Maybe not insurmountable, but raises some issues. If instead it's in two stages, so he put up the visual of the yellow passport. If the app moves in the direction of providing a mechanism by which the government can actually provide something tactile that you can print out and actually have a document. You know, the Biden administration would work very hard to do that. I think that would be enormously beneficial. I should also say that I agree with him about the access to the vaccinations. What a vaccine passport would look like today, where there's still tremendous problems of access, I think would be very different than what it will look like maybe 2 or 3 months from now, where, God willing, we have much more resort to providing supply of vaccines and also equitable distribution.
So a vaccine passport might have to be a long-term project based upon more of the population getting the vaccine. Colleen Connell, what about privacy concerns if this becomes an app, if private companies are developing an app, if governments require some kind of electronic app, do people have to worry about hacking and whether their health information stays secure?
Yes, I think all of those are serious considerations. I think that for such an app to meet at least some really important considerations, it should really make it clear that the user controls the app and the information. And there should be safeguards written into it that the concept of informed consent, which is really what underlies our entire medical, care system in this country, is to give informed consent to a procedure or to sharing information about that procedure. And I think that's really important. I think I would also want safeguards against using the device to track the movement of people who have that device. And you would also want, I think, some pretty serious restrictions on the commercial sale or other use or sharing of information on that app.
Very quickly, Craig Klugman, we only have a few seconds left. We mentioned Israel, the EU. How are their passports, for lack of a better word, working?
Well, in Israel, it's working exactly as we laid out here. So if you want to go to particular restaurants, particular events, you scan a barcode that shows up on your phone and allows you access. New York State has just recently started this with their Excelsior program. So again, if you want to access public things, you put this on. It gets checked against the state database of who's had the vaccine or not. So it's not taking your word. It's harder to forge, say, what the screen would look like, which is another issue. And then you can go in. One of the issues that is really concerning about all these is this question of autonomy, the right to govern yourself. And if these are being used in a way as a carrot, an incentive to get people to get vaccinated, then that makes them a really good thing. But if they're being used as a stick, as if you don't get a vaccine, you don't get access to things, that can be more problematic.
So that's a very important distinction there. All right, so much to consider with this. And our thanks to Craig Klugman, Colleen Connell, and Daniel Rodriguez. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. A new Illinois law could change the tenor and result of negotiations between Chicago Public Schools and the district's teachers union. It comes as the two sides are currently at the table over when in-person classes can resume at CPS high schools. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more on that law and on another one that the governor signed just today as well. Amanda, let's start with this newest law. What does it do?
Brandis, it's a law that materially and immediately really only impacts a small subset of individuals, Chicago firefighters, and really even a subset of them, those who joined the fire department after 2011, but who were born after 1966. But the cost of it is going to be far more widespread, likely to impact every Chicago taxpayer. Here is the quick rundown of that. A state law meant Chicago firefighters born before 66 got one type of pension, a more generous one that comes with a 3% annual bump. The younger firefighters got an annual increase half that much, but 66 wasn't always the cutoff. Every so often, the Illinois legislature would change the date, moving firefighters from the more austere retirement package to the more generous one. State Senator Rob Martwick says making that change for all firefighters was helpful for them, but also honest because it was bound to happen at some point.
And every politician who's ever won has said, oh, no, I'm committed to protecting pensions for our first responders. Well, the way that you protect them is you ensure that you're not kicking the can down the road, that you're putting the money in that is required to pay for the benefit that you actually intend to deliver. And that's what this bill does. It says no more of this language that says, oh yeah, the benefit is actually lower, even though we're going to pay for a higher amount later. It says, no, confront what the cost of your pensions are, put the money in timely.
But critics say the law is going to inflict more pain on a pension fund that is already deeply in debt.
It has 18 cents on the dollar for promises that it's made that it actually has in its bank account. So while we believe that pensions are a promise and we believe that we need to provide a secure retirement to our government workers, we can't do that if it's based on a financially unsustainable system that's at risk of insolvency.
The Illinois Policy Institute's Adam Schuster says that by signing the law, Governor J.B. Pritzker's practically forcing a property tax increase. Now, the IPI is a free market think tank that frequently fights against efforts that are going to cost taxpayers more money, but it is not just the IPI. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot had urged Governor Pritzker to veto the bill because of the financial burden that she says it is going to impose. First responders deserve to be appropriately compensated for their work, both now and in retirement. However, signing this unfunded mandate into law is the exact wrong way to accomplish this goal. A key missing element is an accompanying revenue stream from Springfield to pay for this $18 to $30 million annual new financial obligation. This bill is financially irresponsible and validates a Springfield practice of cutting backroom deals without full transparency and debate. Now, in a statement of his own, the governor did give a nod to those budgetary concerns, saying that his administration is trying to sell the state-owned James R. Thompson Center in the heart of the Loop. And if and when that happens, a private developer will have to start paying property taxes that the state is exempt from, and that will bring Chicago millions more each year. That said, the state has been trying to sell the Thompson Center for years, and nothing has come of it yet. This is the second time in recent days that Governor Pritzker has signed a law impacting Chicago, despite pleas from Mayor Lightfoot to do the opposite. The other law, signed Friday, gives Lightfoot's political nemesis, the Chicago Teachers Union, more power at the bargaining table. In 1995, when Daley was mayor, the state passed a law that limited the CTU to striking over things like wages. This law repeals those limits.
The CTU wants to be able to raise issues like, are students being vaccinated? Just something we were talking about at the table today. Questions about class size, questions about how our schools are staffed in a pandemic, whether there's social and emotional supports. Those are all things in the past that the school district in Chicago has said, we're legally not required to talk with you about this. We choose not to bargain about those subjects. And the fact that the law has now changed and requires them to talk with us about it, we hope makes it easier to win important improvements for the schools in Chicago.
Now, critics, including Schuster, say that this, too, is going to cost taxpayers. He says even without the law, CTU wasn't shy about going on strike. And with more leverage, there is a prediction that CTU will be more prone to do so. CTU, by the way, says they've already, however, been bargaining for things like this in the past. It does, however, give them a bigger hand in the immediate future. Just right now, even today, they were at the bargaining table with CPS over when high school classes can resume in person. The district, by the way, aiming for April 19th. Now, I did speak with a CPS parent of two 6-year-olds about her thoughts on all this.
So I definitely would like there to reach a place where there's communication without tension. I'm hoping that maybe by giving the CTU back some of the bargaining rights that it needed, there could be more conversation and less, tension between the two parties. I do feel that, they are the educators. They kind of know what's going on in the classroom. They do know the needs of their students.
Lopez favors something else that the CTU really wants to happen, and that is an elected school board. Lopez saying that she wants to make sure that parents have representation and that it is diverse. There is a measure before the General Assembly that would do that, but Mayor Lightfoot, she's been against it, saying the board would be too large and unwieldy. The sponsor of that bill, Brandis, Senator Martwick. He says he's keeping up with it. Back to you.
A lot to keep an eye on, of course, Amanda. Thank you. It's been a bloody start to 2021. Chicago recorded 131 homicides in the first 3 months of the year. That's the deadliest first quarter since 2017. Now a measure sitting on Governor J.B. Pritzker's desk, H.R. 158, declares violence a public health crisis with directives for state agencies to identify high violence areas. The bill also takes aim at racial inequities in the state's healthcare system. Joining us to discuss the legislation and its potential impact are State Senator Mike Simmons, a co-sponsor of the bill and whose district includes neighborhoods on Chicago's far north side, and Reverend Anthony Williams of King International Ministries. Reverend Williams is named in the bill and has worked to classify violence as a public health crisis for more than a decade. He lost his own son to gun violence in 2018. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Chicago Tonight. Senator Simmons, let's start with you, please. How will this bill tackle those inequities in the state's healthcare system?
Well, first, Brandis, I want to say thank you to State Senator Maddie Hunter, who was the lead sponsor on this legislation, Camille Lilly over on the House side, and the entire Black Legislative Caucus, with which I am proud to be a member. This legislation was the first major piece of legislation that I voted on as a state senator. As most of you know, I've not been in this seat for even 2 months at this point, and so it was great legislation for me to start out on. And what this bill does is it does a number of things. It's a pretty big measure, but a couple of key points. It requires that state agencies better coordinate healthcare across a very fragmented system, and that's going to be important for healthcare outcomes, particularly when we talk about disparities for racial groups and for people living with mental health conditions. It also requires that there's a racial impact note that's designated in terms of the impact of legislation that is moving through the General Assembly and the enforcement agencies that are in charge of implementing that policy. And so having that racial impact note will get us to a point where we actually have some meat on the bones and some teeth in terms of what we mean when we talk about breaking through institutional racism in our systems.
And Reverend Williams, as we mentioned, sadly, you lost your son to gun violence 3 years ago. How did that tragedy mobilize you and the anti-violence community work that you do?
Well, the citizens just felt that we had to acknowledge the fact that violence is a public health crisis, and it is. The CDC has said that violence is also a pandemic and a public health crisis. And I want to congratulate our citizens in Illinois and our state lawmakers. We're the first state in the union to talk in terms of identifying and acknowledging that violence is a public health crisis, and we can't continue to live with abnormal behavior anymore.
And Reverend Williams, one of the things that this measure would do is direct state agencies like the Illinois Departments of Public Health and Human Services to embark on a study that would identify high violence communities for program funding as well as economic development. Which communities do you think would benefit from that kind of investment?
You can start off with my old neighborhood, Inglewood. You could also take the southern suburbs like Dalton, Roseland, Woodlawn, Lawndale. And so East St. Louis, it's enough to go around in terms of dealing with this pandemic of violence.
What kind of programming and economic development would you like to see for those communities?
Well, I mean, when you talk about equity, fairness, the resources going to the proper people who have measurements to show proof that they're dealing with the issue of violence, preventative programs that we need so badly.
And Senator Simmons, several of your colleagues opposing this measure have cited fiscal concerns amid the state's budget woes, of course, during a very challenging fiscal year. But measures like funding for violent communities is subject to appropriation by the General Assembly. Do you think your colleagues will follow through?
You know, the intention is absolutely to follow through, right? I mean, we can't solve this epidemic of violence in this city, in this state, and across the country if we're not willing to put our money where our mouths are. And we know that in many instances that the programs that are required to combat violence, the number of mentors that we need for our young people, the number of mental health professionals that we need to have deployed when we have people that are in crisis, where if we don't have that intervention, the outcome is likely to be a violent one. When we don't have those systemic responses in place for people that are in pain, right, then we're not going to be able to turn the tide on any of these issues. And so, you know, like I said, I'm new to the General Assembly and I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I think that the intention is there to, you know, break through on these issues. I mean, we as the Reverend said, we've been talking about this issue for years, right? Defining violence as a public health emergency and having a public health epidemiological response to the issue is really important if we're going to actually make systemic progress on reducing violence across the board.
And Senator, you say you're new to the General Assembly, but we know you're not new to Chicago. What do you think are some of the root causes that lead to violence in the city?
Right, and I'm glad, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of this is just, we're talking about, in the 7th district where I'm the state senator, it's economic violence. We're talking about families who are working 2 and 3 jobs, who are expected to be able to take care of their families, and they can't, right? They don't have health insurance. They're not able to put food on the table. This is the only country where we have people working 40 and 50 hours a week, and we've become normalized to the idea that they should be able to struggle and not be able to actually take care of themselves, not be able to pay their bills. And so that's a big issue. When we talk about returning citizens in my district and many of the communities that the Reverend talked about, who come back into the communities and they're not able to find work, or they go through job placement programs where the outcomes are just not there. 6 months later, 12 months later, 2 years later, these people are still not employed. That's a big problem. And so we've got to have a structural response to those types of issues.
And we're currently, as we mentioned earlier, seeing this very dramatic spike in violence. The first quarter of 2021 with 131 killings recorded, the deadliest since 2017. Reverend Williams, do you fear that these numbers will only get worse, especially as we get into the summer months when violence is notoriously worse?
It's so important that we push. That's why this bill is so important. Civility is so sorely needed. Civility. We had to uncool violence. Violence ain't cool. And so civility is so important. That's what this bill does. Is it educates. It deals with collaboration. You're talking about structural violence, institutional violence. Civility. Civility is key in redirecting the funding to those agencies who are out there with boots on the ground. This is an intelligent piece of legislation. It is the vaccine. It is the vaccine to the violence that's occurring in Illinois. Once we pass an Illinois impact to public policies, then we go federal, and we put it on President Joe Biden's desk.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. My thanks to Reverend Anthony Williams and State Senator Mike Simmons for joining us. Up next, an immersive experience set in the 1920s. Stick around. Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. What do you believe prevents a strong coalition of Black and Latino communities forming across the communities?
I want us to, as a nation, to find a way to come together.
Go down the block, get it from someone local, and keep the money in the community.
Black joy and the Black experience is magical.
We have a whole lot more ahead on the program, including how community members in Little Village are mobilizing to honor a teenage victim of a police shooting. But first, tired of the lack of variety live streams were offering during the pandemic, Evanston artist Steve Rashid decided to mix it up and create a more immersive experience that could take people to another time. With the help of his sons and their network of artists from around the country, they created Into the Mist. Arts correspondent Angel Ito introduces us to a virtual show unlike any other.
Never thought our love would ever fade away.
Music for me always is a reflection of a time and a culture.
The time, 1927. The place? Well, that's for you to decide. It's all a part of a new immersive online exploration of the 1920s called Into the Mist.
Is caring for you.
You turn left and you're in a room in Paris, but you walk across the hall and you're in Harlem, and then you go another room and you're in LA, you know, because these performers are imagining themselves in these different rooms in different cities.
With the help of Zoom, viewers from all over the world travel back to 1927, exploring different rooms of artists and entertainers as young as 23 and as old as 85. For instance, one husband and wife duo throw a rent party performance in Harlem.
I got the St. Louis blues, just as blue as I can be.
There was so much going on in the arts in Harlem at that time, you know, with music and with poetry.
So the rent parties served as they were social gatherings
They were places that employed musicians.
That sense of community can be felt in any room, no matter the circumstance.
Oh, I see you. Yes, Kevin.
A lady, because it was only me and her in the room, and she was like, I started like talking to her. Yeah, after it, she was just like, I really loved being in your room. Like, it was nice to just talk to somebody instead of like it just being a show. So I took that with a grain of salt, and I'm like starting to do that a little bit more than, just performing for myself and also performing with the audience.
This is the only really live experience that I've been able to have in this entire pandemic, where it actually feels like I'm on the spot. There are people in the room with me, and every night is different. Every single show is different. You never know what you're going to get, and that's the part of the joy as an artist of live performance.
Activities range from poetry readings to character drawings to playing card games with blackjack dealers. But with so many rooms to visit in 1 hour, viewers often come back to see what they missed.
One night, there was a family of 3 sisters that all came, and they all lived in different cities. One was in San Francisco, one was in Austin, I think one was in, LA. And just so happens, they all joined the blackjack room at the same time, and they were all sitting at the table right with each other. And the banter between these 3 sisters about their betting style, you're gonna hit, you're gonna stay, so that was really, really funny.
And while the experience is more about exploration than history lessons, there are still some learning moments.
Placing the drinks within the context of the time then helps, I think, immerse people a little bit more in what's going on and who some of the current players are, and adds to the immersion.
It's at the very end of the night that everyone from every room finally comes together for the final show.
When you see them in the club, it's a powerful thing. And suddenly you see hundreds of people in their homes dancing to the Cellar Boys. The first night, we had cast members in tears because it was such a powerful thing to realize that we had given this experience to all these people. And there were hundreds of people all gathered together in the same place, albeit virtually. But they were all having the same experience at the same time and enjoying it.
I've got a man that I bought to welcome you, sweet child.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
Say honest and true, sweet child, I'm wild about you.
Now that looks like a roaring good time. Into the Mist is every Friday evening from 9 to 10:30 through the end of the month, with tickets at $18. Costumes are encouraged, but not required. And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
It's a very clever concept, Paris. And if it's only on Fridays at 9, then we can go right after Weekend Review.
All right, I'll make reservations.
Get that costume. Still to come on Chicago Tonight. Alden Global Capital was once the only bidder for Tribune Publishing. Now it has competition. Find out who, plus more from Cranes. Little Village community members are mobilizing to honor 13-year-old Adam Toledo, who was fatally shot by police last week. And the CDC says it's safe for vaccinated people to travel, but how could a new surge of COVID cases impact the summer vacation season? But first, some more of today's top stories. Chicagoans now have 2 new mass vaccination sites to choose from, one on the north side next to Wrigley Field and one on the south side at Chicago State University.
This collaboration with the community that you see is important not only in building equitable access for the vaccine, but also a key step in building a more just city of Chicago.
The city's Department of Public Health partnered with the university, the Cubs, and Advocate Aurora Health, among other community organizations and providers, to establish the sites. The one at Chicago State University will serve 1,200 walk-up appointments and 1,000 drive-through appointments per day. The one at Gallagher Way next to Wrigley can accommodate up to 2,000 doses per day. Both locations are by appointment only and for Chicago residents only. And the Illinois Department of Public Health says more than 2,100 more people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus and 11 more have died since yesterday. And now to Paris for some of today's top business headlines. Paris.
Thanks, Brandis. United Airlines takes a stance against the Georgia voting law. Hedge fund Alden Global Capital risks losing the Tribune publishing deal, and marijuana sales reach yet another record high. Here to go behind the headlines is Crain's Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer. Ann, great to see you again. So let's start with Chicago-based United Airlines. They put out a statement criticizing the Georgia voting law, saying in part, quote, some have questioned the integrity of the nation's election systems and are using it to justify stricter voting procedures, even though numerous studies have found zero credible evidence of widespread fraud. Legislation that infringes on the right to vote of fellow Americans is wrong. And this comes on the heel of organizations like Major League Baseball pulling the All-Star game, Coke. We've seen organizations with ties to Georgia do stuff. Why did United Airlines feel it wanted to get involved?
I think for two reasons, Paris. One, Atlanta is a big market for United. The Hartsfield International Airport is a place where they have a footprint. And secondly, one of their arch rivals, Delta, is based in Atlanta. And Delta led the way in making a pretty strong statement against this law a couple of weeks ago, right after it was passed. So I think United feels like they want to be on the right side of history, at least as they see it here. They aren't threatening to do anything more substantive than a statement. They're not talking about pulling investment from Georgia or anything like that. As far as repercussions go, really the only yardstick we have to measure that is social media at this point. And as far as we've seen, it's been a loud response, but it's been mostly positive.
And it, more like a slap on the wrist here from United. Let's move on to the Tribune deal. The hedge fund Alden Global Capital, they were once the only bidder to take over all of the Tribune publishing company. Now there is a new team of bidders with a richer deal. Tell us who they are and whether this bid could be successful.
The competition is a combined bid, actually, Paris, from two investors. One is a Maryland hotel magnate named Stuart Bynum, and the second is a Swiss billionaire named Hans-Jörg Wyss. Wyss is piggybacking on an earlier bid from Bynum, and together they've submitted a $680 million buyout offer for Tribune Publishing that amounts to about $18.50 a share. Today, a special committee that's been appointed by the board to review takeover acquisition offers like this did issue a statement saying that they consider the Bynum-Wyss bid to be reasonably likely to beat out a previous offer by the rather notorious hedge fund Alden Global, which of course is famous as a slash and burn style buyer of media properties. Alden's offer is worth $17.25 a share. So if the Bynum-Wyss bid passes due diligence, Alden is likely going to have to up its bid if they want to prevail.
And I know that there are a lot of curious onlookers, including reporters and editors at the Chicago Tribune, that are very worried about a full takeover by Alden. So we'll have to see what happens there. And finally, recreational marijuana sales once again across the state hit a new record. Why?
Mainly, our reporting shows two things. The industry did see an increase in retail shops around the state. So with the number of retail outlets going up, more customers can be reached, therefore more sales, right? But another boost seems to have come in March when those federal stimulus checks hit a lot of Illinoisans' bank accounts.
Interesting. So they're using the stimulus checks for certain types of purchases. All right. Ann Dwyer, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. Last week, 13-year-old Adam Toledo was killed by a Chicago police officer. The Little Village community held a vigil this evening and are mobilizing to provide support for his family. But the family and community are still waiting for answers about that shooting. After originally claiming that they could not release body camera footage of the shooting, the police oversight agency now says they will be releasing that footage. Joining us to discuss this is Matt Topic, an attorney at Lovey & Lovey, and we were hoped to be joined by Baltazar Enriquez, president of the Little Village Community Council, and we're still hoping that he can join the call soon. We should also say that we invited a representative from the Chicago Police Department to join us, but they declined, saying that this is currently still a COPA investigation, so they're unable to comment at this time. Matt Topic, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So earlier today, we heard from Superintendent Brown. He laid out shedding a bit more light on how this incident with Adam Toledo happened last week. Bring us up to speed on where we are right now with this video being released by COPA.
Sure. So in the immediate wake of the story breaking, which was a couple days after the shooting actually occurred, and the original statement by the police didn't indicate that it was a 13-year-old. So after it became known it was a 13-year-old, Mr. Toledo, there was obviously immediate outcry to get more information. But the first thing we got from the police department was a press release that said there was an armed confrontation and that they recovered a gun. They immediately tweeted a photograph of the gun that they said that they recovered, but they refused to release the videos on the grounds of the Juvenile Court Act. That is a law that is intended to allow juveniles who get into trouble with police and with the law to move on with their lives, to have those records remain confidential. And in case after case, we have successfully argued that the Juvenile Court Act does not apply when the police shoot and kill a juvenile or when the juvenile dies at all. And so in the immediate days or immediate moments after the story broke, originally COPA said, well, we're not going to release anything because of the Juvenile Court Act. More and more attention got paid to the fact that the city has lost that argument repeatedly. And then eventually COPA agreed that there is nothing in the Juvenile Court Act that prohibits them from releasing the video. And they have said they are going to release the video promptly.
Any sense, Matt, of the timeline and how soon we could be viewing this video?
Normally, the family appropriately gets the opportunity to see the video privately first before it's made public. I don't know if that has yet happened. I know there was talk of that happening early this week. And so beyond that, the video release policy that the city now has gives COPA up to 60 days to release the video. They seem to have indicated they're going to do it more quickly, and given that even today the mayor has released more information now saying that Mr. Toledo had a gun. I don't think that has really been out there prior to the mayor saying that. So with all these things that are continuing to be released, there is really no reason for the city to withhold it any longer than as necessary to allow the family to view it first.
What's your reaction to the police department tweeting a picture of the gun, especially as we're hearing conflicting reports of whether or not Mr. Toledo had the gun or if the gun was simply recovered at the scene?
These are the kinds of things that make people distrustful of police narratives around these kinds of incidents. We saw the same thing in the Harith Augustus shooting in South Shore a couple of summers ago. You get an immediate story from the police about what they said happened. Then there's some pushback. There's some growing unrest about it, and then they will release selective amounts of information that are consistent with the police narrative, but withhold the rest of the information, normally on the grounds that they say, well, we still have to interview witnesses, and if the videos are released, then the witnesses will see the video, and then we won't know if we're getting a true story from the witnesses, ignoring the fact that they have already told any witness that if they saw something different than the police, they're at odds with the police. So if you're really concerned about maintaining the integrity of witness interviews, then why is the police department out there releasing this sort of selective information? So we've seen this in case after case. There's the initial report with the police version of what happened. When there's some pushback, they'll release a little more. When there's more pushback, they'll release even more. The city needs to be more consistent, and it needs to be a lot more transparent, because you can't expect people to trust the police if they're not open and transparent about how they're conducting themselves.
And Matt, I want to play a clip. Earlier today, we heard from Mayor Lori Lightfoot speaking about this very subject.
Let's be clear. An adult put a gun in a child's hand, a young, impressionable child, and one who should not have been provided with lethal force, a weapon that could and did irreparably change the course of his life.
Now, the mayor has said that she has not seen the video at the time of that press conference this morning. Matt, have you seen any shift in transparency from this administration when it comes to these kinds of CPD shootings? And I apologize, we've got about 60 seconds.
I wish that we did, but we haven't. This is a mayor who ran on transparency. I served on a transition committee to help her get more transparent than the Emanuel administration. And unfortunately, we've really seen largely a continuation. What has changed is that Laquan McDonald, the city fought that in court until a court ordered that the video be released. So I think this administration has learned a bit of a lesson of that, at least politically, that that they didn't want to be in that position of a court forcing them to release videos. And so, to their credit, they have eventually owned up here that they do have to release the videos. But it was only after there was pushback. In a truly transparent administration, you wouldn't have to push back so hard.
Matt Topic, we've 10 seconds. Have you been in contact with the family of Adam Toledo?
I have not. I can only imagine that the pain they're suffering. My heart, like many other, goes out to them, and I hope they can move forward.
Absolutely, Matt Topic. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Up next, could a new surge of COVID cases impact the summer travel season? But first, a look at the weather.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say it's safe for fully vaccinated people to travel, although they still advise against non-essential trips.
For domestic travel, fully vaccinated people do not need to get a COVID-19 test before or after travel and do not need to self-quarantine after travel. For example, fully vaccinated grandparents can fly to visit their healthy grandkids without getting a COVID-19 test or self-quarantining.
But will the latest surge in COVID-19 cases around the world scuttle summer vacations, especially overseas? Joining us with more are Dr. Robert Murphy, director of the Institute for Global Health at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, Claire Bushy, a Chicago-based reporter covering the airline industry for the Financial Times, and John Conena, president of Venus Travel, a travel agency on Chicago's northwest side. Welcome all of you back to Chicago tonight. I want to start with you, Dr. Murphy. Do you agree with the new CDC guidelines in that it is safe for folks who are fully vaccinated to travel without getting tested?
Oh, absolutely. The vaccines that we have out there today, the 3 that are approved right now in the United States, are incredibly effective. Way more than originally anticipated. And hey, take advantage of it. You're 90 to 95% protected.
So no need to get the test before coming back into the country or traveling domestically before coming back. Claire Bushy, let's take a look at the air travel data. TSA has tracked about 1.5 million travelers yesterday, way up from the 120,000 number from a year ago that day. Still down 1 million passengers from 2019. How's the airline industry feel about these numbers?
Well, the chief executives of the large U.S. carriers are overjoyed that things are improving because, as you point out, they're better than they were a year ago. They are still radically bad if you want to compare them to 2 years ago. But some improvement is better than none. It's primarily been in leisure travel, though, and that's a bit of a concern for Chicago's airline, United, because much of their money comes from business class travel.
So business travel still lagging. John Conena, what about from your vantage point as a travel agency? How are bookings doing, and are there places that are better than others? Domestic, Mexico, Europe?
Yeah, we're right at the moment. Paris, Mexico has been a hot commodity, especially during these spring break days. And of course, Florida has been unbelievable with fares under $100 on any carrier. But the market that needs to improve, and I don't see it improving, is the European market, just because of this situation with the vaccination that Dr. Murphy had mentioned.
And there's a surge in several European countries right now. Dr. Murphy,
yes,
we're seeing a surge in this country as well. Is increased air travel contributing to that surge, Dr. Murphy?
Any movement of people that are potentially infected is bad for the epidemic, for the pandemic. So, as you can see from these guidelines, yes, it's safer to go. You don't have as many requirements if you're vaccinated, but the recommendation is still put off the travel if you can put it off.
And it still seems like it's business travelers that are still putting that off, not so much leisure travelers. Claire Bushy, we talked about vaccine passports in an earlier segment on the show. Curious, what are airline stances on vaccine passports or proof of vaccination?
The airlines are in favor of anything that helps reopen travel lanes because in particular, traveling to Europe continues to still be down, and transatlantic travel is a huge moneymaker for the airlines. So they are in favor of anything and everything that gets more people in seats flying.
Might airlines require a vaccine, having had your vaccine or being fully vaccinated?
Well, right now there's not enough people that are vaccinated. That's the problem.
Do you think, but at some point when vaccination rates go up, that airlines might require that?
Oh, absolutely.
And you think that would, obviously you think that would be a good move. John, what about demand for summer travel? Summer is such a busy season for airlines, especially for leisure travel. Do you anticipate travel picking up over the summer as vaccination rates improve here, or could the situation in Europe scuttle that as well?
Well, I really do see it getting better because of the little bit of what happened here in the spring. But again, if I'm going to continue to harp on this European thing, like Dr. Murphy and Claire have said, the Europe situation becomes very critical just because places like France, Italy, Spain, Greece are having their issues with the vaccine. Either they don't have enough or they can't distribute it to the people like we are doing here in the U.S.
Dr. Murphy, when do you expect the rates of vaccination to catch up with the surge in cases that we've seen over the last few weeks and maybe start to bend that curve dramatically?
Well, that's the race that's going on right now. Here in Illinois, we're vaccinating over 100,000 people a day. I mean, this is an incredible pace. We're doing actually pretty well. And in the next 3 months, you're going to have the vast majority of people that want to take a vaccine are going to be able to have had it.
And that's certainly going to speed up. If it's a tortoise and a hare here, the hare might start to speed up here, the hare being vaccination. Claire Bushy, how long can airlines survive financially without robust international travel, without robust business travel?
Well, that's a good question. Generally speaking, the four major U.S. carriers are largely considered to be out of the danger zone in terms of filing for bankruptcy, but they do have large amounts of debt. American Airlines, in particular, has a very large amount of debt because they bought a new fleet, essentially, right before the pandemic made the bottom fell out of the market. So it will be a long time before the airlines are able to fully recover financially from the pandemic, even with all the taxpayer support that they've received over the last year.
I was going to say a lot of money coming in from some of those government loans. John Canena, same question in terms of the travel agency industry. How long can companies like yours go forward without more robust international travel, without more robust leisure travel?
Well, I have to tell you that European market, and especially for the agency that I've had, that is a market that basically is the profitable side of my business. And if it doesn't pick up, it's going to be a problem. I mean, another year of this, I don't know how Europe, we'll forget about the airlines for 2 seconds, how Europe is surviving without the tourism. Europe needs the tourism. And this really becomes a huge issue. But I'm going to agree with Claire. Sometimes these airlines are getting out of the danger zone of the bankruptcy, whatever, how the government is handling or what. But the major four seem to always have a way to get out of this. But we need a lot of help, that's for sure.
Dr. Murphy, you mentioned that you do anticipate vaccine rates really picking up in the United States. What is the situation in European countries, and why is the situation a little more complicated there?
Well, it's really a disaster there. They are very bureaucratic. They try to act as one, but it's really all these different countries. And they were late to the vaccine purchase game. And now they're paying for it. They had the biggest bet they had was the AstraZeneca vaccine, and there's been all this trouble with the AstraZeneca. So they gambled on that one, and that one is problematic. So now the vaccine production is going to ramp up wildly in the next couple months. And so they're going to play catch up, but they may miss the summer.
Interesting. Well, a lot to keep in mind, and our thanks to Dr. Robert Murphy, Claire Bushy, and John Conena. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Local members of Congress talk about safety on Capitol Hill after last week's deaths, as well as the jobs and infrastructure proposal.
Plus, a Chicago bakery fuses Mexican flavors with Jewish tradition. We give you a taste of what the bakers have to offer. And we leave you tonight with some music from Into the Mist, a new immersive experience you can catch Friday evenings over Zoom. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
What do you know of love? And you call it madness. Ah, but I call it love. At first the slight suggestion that grew to haunt my mind was the eternal question. True love is hard to find. And then the day I found you, my love I had to share. I built my dreams around you. Somehow you made me care.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.